So I do love Christmas, but we do have Thanksgiving this week. But honestly, this kind of begins this whole season that has all kinds of mixed emotions for some people. I want you to know I acknowledge that. It's not always an easy season for everybody. If you listen to song lyrics or you start seeing the commercials, or if your algorithms have been hijacked by the Hallmark Christmas channel, you see all kinds of pictures right about now of families getting around tables and sitting around trees and seeing snow fall and frost on windows and all kinds of different stuff like that, these Pinterest-infused moments. For some people, those images and caricatures of the holiday season just feel like privilege. Not everybody has those experiences. Not everybody has even some of those memories. And in any case, though, one thing that you do see, I think, in all of that really begins to play out is this same central theme of the idea of coming home. There's this feeling of coming home during the holidays. Now, I underestimated how powerful that imagery was a few years ago. The idea of coming home, sitting around a table with a family, or opening gifts with a family, or celebrating the holidays with a family, coming home, I underestimated that. I grew up in a little picturesque town with a town square called Washington, Illinois, with one of our band members here. And this is this cute little picturesque town in central Illinois, just outside of Peoria. It has a town square. There's a fountain in the middle, and they stick a nativity scene on it every Christmas. I grew up a few blocks from there on a brick street, and it was just kind of one of those warm, fuzzy places that it was fun to go back to every holiday. My mom died in 2012, and then my dad, when he died in April of 2018, something happened that I didn't anticipate. We always were able to go home, like Thanksgiving, Christmas, all these different times. We just could always go home, and that was home. I grew up there. It was the house I grew up in. But after my dad died, we sold the house, and honestly, all ties to that place really kind of ended in that moment. We've, I think, been back maybe twice since 2018, just to kind of swing through and see the house or go to a funeral and different things like that. But for all intents and purposes, I didn't just lose family members in that moment. I lost a sense of place. I always felt like Washington, Illinois was where I belonged because I was so familiar with it. It just felt comfortable to me. It felt welcoming to me. I knew people there. I have memories of streets. I have memories of how it felt to be raised by neighbors in that community and all kinds of different things. And so there's that aspect in 2018 where, my dad had died, but something else had died too. My tie to a place. A tie to a place where I felt like I belonged. Now, Shelley and I have been good. Wherever we go is home. This is home. This feels like home to us. We're very glad to live in Portage. This is our home. But I think you understand what I mean. There's that sense of going to that place where you know you belong. And I think God created in all of us a longing. I do. To want a place where we belong, where we know that no matter where we've been or where we've gone or what we've done, there's a place that will wrap its arms around us. There are people that will wrap their arms around us, a place of comfort, a place where we kind of get a sense of peace. In fact, I think there's a restlessness in us that longs for that. There's something in us that wants to find our way home and to see ourselves in that, maybe that Hallmark Channel picture. We want to see ourselves there. So the parable of the prodigal son, it's not an abstract parable. Some of the parables that Jesus tells are very, very metaphorical. Soils and different things like that. I mean, there's just a lot of metaphor involved. This one, not so much. This one, you and I are meant to see ourselves in. It's not abstract. And that includes the people who were listening to Jesus tell this for the first time 2,000 years ago. And we're wrapping this parable up today at the end of a long series in the parables of Jesus. And if you weren't here, I'd encourage you to download the app. You can see the QR code on the screen there. Pastor Travis and Pastor Ben did a great job bringing us to where we are today. They introduced us to the parable of the prodigal son. We got to meet the prodigal son. We got to meet the father last week from Pastor Ben. And I don't want to summarize everything, but let me just kind of give you a snapshot to bring you to where we are today. The parable of the prodigal son. So long story short, there's a young man. This young man, I think, is from what we could consider to be a wealthy family. He goes to his father one day and says, "Father, I would like my inheritance now." This is the kind of a thing that you would get after your father passes away. So this is kind of a shameful request. In a way, this son asking for his inheritance now is saying, I just don't really care about you, Dad. Whether you're alive or dead, doesn't matter to me. You're dead to me right now. So I would just like my stuff, and I'm going to go. So his father loves his son, gives him his portion of the inheritance, at which point the son turns, goes to a foreign land, and when we read that, we can read into the fact that it's a land that is not the land he came from. He wasn't raised this way. He wasn't raised in this religion. And so he goes to this foreign land, and we find out really quickly he's not particularly disciplined. And he spends his entire inheritance, he loses his entire inheritance on what could be called wild living. You can read into that whatever you want, and probably some things you shouldn't. But he loses all of this money. He loses an ability to take care of himself, finds himself not very long after that destitute. He finds himself at a place where he can't feed himself, he can't take care of himself. He has nothing, but he's burned all these bridges, right? He can't go home because he's burned all those bridges. So he finds a man who says, "You can come and you can come sleep with my pigs. And you have to take care of them and you have to feed them and different things like that, but this is your life now." And so he does that. He does this just so he has a place to lay his head. He does this just so he can take care of himself. He finds himself one day longing to fill himself. Like he's so hungry and desperate that he's going to start eating the scraps that are covered with manure and dirt and all kinds of different things, the things that are being fed to these pigs. To make it worse, pigs were unclean animals religiously. If you even associated with swine, it made you unfit to participate in the religious structure of the day. So he was out. So here he is. He's looking at this food. And he says in Scripture, he came to his senses. In a moment of sobriety, he realizes, you know what? My dad's a pretty good guy. And I've probably made a mistake here. And he says, you know, my dad's servants, even his hired hands, they're treated 1,000,000 times better than this. And I know I've blown it. I know I've screwed up. I can't go back and be like, I'm back. He's like, I can't do that. But maybe if I go back, because my dad is such a good man, he'll allow me to be one of his hired servants. At least then I'll have a place to put my head. At least then I won't be so destitute. At least then I won't be hungry. And so that's what he does. He gets up and decides to go home. And that leads us to this amazing scene that Pastor Ben shared about last week. You see the scripture on the screen, Luke 15, verse 20. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And so they began to celebrate. A couple things before we move on into what happens next. Jesus made a bunch of enemies in his 33 years on this planet. Most specifically, the religious leaders of the day. Now, there was a group of religious leaders. I know we talk about this quite a bit, but they really just didn't like him. He would do stuff every once in a while, like he would come up to these religious leaders. These are the ones that laid out all the authority spiritually, even socially, for a lot of different things. He would be like, "You guys are kind of self-righteous. How would you like that?" Like, "Thanks, Jesus." I mean, has anybody ever called you self-righteous? Then he would show up and he'd be like, "You know what, guys? You're kind of hypocrites." Okay, that's a horrible indictment. If somebody walked up to you and said, "You know what? Hey, I know you're pretty good, Shelley. I'll pick on my wife. She's my wife. You're kind of a hypocrite. I'm basically saying to my wife, you're not who you say you are. You're pretending to be somebody that you're not. He said it to their face. Like, this is what Jesus did. Even though Jesus would do this stuff to these religious leaders, the worst thing that was going on in their life at that moment was the fact that he was replacing them. There's all of these people who had looked to these religious leaders as their authority for years and years and years. The entire social and religious structure, the political structure, everything was built for all of these followers to be looking to these religious leaders to lay out authority for their life. If they were going to be right with God, the religious leaders are the ones that were going to say how it happened. And generally speaking, they took advantage of that. They'd married themselves to the politics of the day. Okay, so then there was this duality that was going on in the religious leaders' lives at this moment that was all based on power and income. And here's what Jesus did. He shows up and he starts messing around with their stuff. He starts messing around. They want to do this and this and this, and Jesus is like, I don't think you should do that. They're like, knock it off. Next thing you know, all of these people, they're like, we kind of like what Jesus is saying. We kind of like what Jesus is doing. We actually feel free when we follow Jesus. And so what was going on at that time was all of these people who were following the religious leaders now have turned their loyalty and they're following this man from Nazareth, this nobody, this guy who was so backwards and saying all the wrong things, all of the wrong things. And so they get really, really frustrated because Jesus was screwing up their stuff. So they want to discredit him. And right before we get to Luke 15, they're really, really upset. They're really upset, and their indictment is Jesus is hanging around with prostitutes and tax collectors. He's eating and drinking with sinners all the time. He's out there hanging around with all the wrong people. And so Jesus launches into these three stories, these three parables in Luke chapter 15. Now, to discredit him, basically what they do is almost like they pull out their phone. We're going to go to social media here, and they make like a political hack post about Jesus. It's going to be pretty hard to pull off this Messiah stuff while he's hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes. Post it up, hashtag screwed up, whatever. I mean, essentially they're trying to discredit him and frame him in a way. And so Jesus is like, not only do you get to frame me, let me paint the picture for you. He's like, I'll take the picture for you and just give it to you, which is exactly what he does. Because up until now, up until what I just read from Luke chapter 15 and about the Father and him coming home and all that stuff, up until that point, all the religious leaders would have been kind of on board with what Jesus was saying. This kid had asked for his inheritance. He'd gone out and blown it. Shame. He brought shame upon himself. He brought shame upon the family. Brought shame upon the father for doing all of those different things. And now he's going to come home. And I can guarantee you all the religious leaders are like, here we go. They leaned in because they know this is the moment where the father has 100% every right to drop the hammer. He gets to drop the hammer on this shameful son. And the Pharisees and the religious leaders get to hear how God handles those who disobey, how God handles those who find themselves on the outside, how God stands and postures himself towards those who've brought shame to God, shame to the Father. And so all these religious leaders, they're leaning in this moment. And what happens is, in that text I read earlier, is the very reason Jesus was hung on a cross. What we just read, as innocuous as it sounds, is the very reason they killed Jesus. We're going to come back to that. But verse 20 says, he got up, came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. That right there is the thing that got Jesus crucified. In one sweeping moment, Jesus dismantles the image of God that so many of those people had been taught to have. And so let me ask you a question. What picture of God are you carrying around? And is it the picture that Jesus creates? Or is it some other picture? Is it one where God, knowing everything about you, let that sit for a second, knowing everything about you, a God who really sees you, embraces you, welcomes you home as though you belong, with a kiss? This is totally unorthodox. This is not how this is supposed to work. But the Father, in this situation, is doing exactly what Jesus himself was doing, what Jesus had done. He came down to our drama. He entered our drama. He entered our shame, ran to greet us, throws his arms around us, and reconciles with us, even if we don't deserve it. Even so. And all this happens with the Son doing nothing. The Son did absolutely nothing other than going home. All he did was went home. That's all he did. He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. He just went home. It says, but the Father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe. Put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Really quickly, every single nobleman had a robe. Usually it was adorned in certain colors that were specific to that family. And this is what he does. It identified you as a person in that family, identified you as a head of that family. He takes that robe and he places it on this sinner. He places a robe and covers this sinner. Then you have the ring. I imagine you've all probably seen movies or different things. It would have been kind of like a signet ring. There would have been a seal on it. It would have been the family seal. So that when you signed a document or different things like that, you closed it up and had the wax and you pressed it in the wax. It was a symbol of authority, familial authority. And so what does he do? He takes the ring, he puts it on the finger of this sinner son, this sinner. And then you have the sandals. What's with the sandals? Sandals meant that I'm taking care of you. He didn't stand sandals. You took care of your own. So he wasn't providing sandals for his hired servants. He wasn't handing out sandals to the slaves. He was taking care of his own. He was putting sandals on his own child's feet to protect his child, because his child was one of his. He belonged to him. All of this is done for this prodigal son. So, what does it mean to be prodigal? Or, this is a better question, who is prodigal? Who is prodigal? Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied. And your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him? My son, the father said, you're always with me, everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad because your brother was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and now he's found. So the older son would have been the very first one to get to wear that robe, probably at his wedding day. Would have been a symbol of passing on some of the family legacy and heritage. He would have worn that robe, the first son, on his wedding day. But now it's the other son who's wearing that robe. The first son would have been the one that would have received, as part of his inheritance, as the oldest son, he would have received that ring, because he would have then been in charge of the entire family business. He would have been in charge of all the family affairs and would have had to have carried the authority to pull off all of the family affairs. So he's the one that would have been wearing that ring after his father passed. But now that ring sits on the finger of that other prodigal son, the sinner. The sandals, all of it. The sandals were a gift for those who belonged, not a hired hand or a servant, but a son. In that moment, the Pharisees listening and the religious leaders, they saw themselves outside of the party. Outside of the party. It wasn't the younger brother that they had an issue with. He was angry. He didn't like the younger brother. The younger brother had screwed up. The younger brother had done all these wrong things. The younger brother was wrong. He was wrong. He wasn't right. He was wrong. But the older brother was not mad at the younger brother, was he? He was mad at the father. Listen, who is a prodigal? Who is a prodigal? Because here's the deal. I think sometimes in our minds, and we like to see ourselves as different characters, I'm not sure any of us sign up to see ourselves as the older brother in this story. We'd rather be the younger brother in the story than the older brother. Because it seems like there's somebody in this story that doesn't get it. And I think that the church sometimes can be full of people who are actually outside of the party, not because they're frustrated with a bunch of sinners, but because they have a disproportionate and messed up picture of who God is. They're waiting for God to smite all the people that they don't like. And in the midst of it, they're missing the absolute remarkable thing that God is doing right in their midst. Jesus is standing in front of these people, doing miracles, restoring people, bringing in, dispensing grace. And yet they're so distorted in their picture of who God is. They're not a part of the party. They're not a part of the party. So who is the prodigal? And here's what I want to tell you today. The prodigal is anybody who still has an invitation to come home. And I think sometimes that invitation goes to people who think they're already home. And you can see it. You can see it. You can see that they're missing the party and they think that they're home, but they're not already home. I'm not questioning salvation. It's a whole different conversation. But they're not a part of the party. And you can see it in the way they posture themselves towards people in this world. The hate and the resentment and the bitterness and anger that is dispensed out of the mouths and fingertips of Christians betrays what we say and sing about this God we say we serve. Over and over and over again. And so the call is not just for some sinner prodigal who's gone out and wasted his money on prostitutes and all this stuff. I think the call is also for the prodigals who are already at home. Saying, are you gonna come to me too? Are you going to let God be the God who he says he is, who he acts like he is, the one who sacrifices himself to redeem once for all? Well, we let God be God. Anybody who still has an invitation to come home is a prodigal. So a son, believed dead by his own actions, was home. A father grieved at the loss of a son had his son back. It was a celebration. Heaven touched earth in that moment. Nothing could contain their joy. And so they had a party, which I think is absolutely cool. I think is absolutely amazing. He goes on in Luke 15, says every time a sinner repents, literally the angels in heaven throw a party. There's a party in heaven every time somebody comes to faith in Jesus Christ. I like that. I hope there's a party every day that I'm there when I die. Okay? And there's good food. But seriously, heaven in that moment, that father probably never anticipated he would see his son ever again. There he was. And the other prodigal turned down the invitation to the party. What does that say? I want you to pause for a second. Because this is how good God is. He's so much better than me. Instead of scolding the older son, the father is gentle. He pleads with the older son. And listen closely, because look at the nature of what he does. He leaves the party, he leaves the celebration, and goes to where the sin is. And in that moment, it's present in this older prodigal son. Jesus Christ left heaven to come enter our drama, to meet us exactly where we are. So that right there is a picture of who God is. God makes the first step. He's the one that invites. He's the seeker. He is the initiator. The Father left the celebration. He left in order to seek and save that which was what? Lost. The one who is still home. He reached out to this prodigal the same way he reached out to the other, because in essence, this is not the story of a prodigal son. This is the story of what some have called a prodigal God. Because these are the actions of a God that nobody expected. The word prodigal means extravagant and reckless. That's what it means to be a prodigal son. I've been an extravagant and reckless son. For those people that are listening on that day, particularly if they were of the flavor of the older son, Jesus was describing a prodigal God. It was a God who was being reckless and extravagant in this mercy, in this grace. This is a story about God. It's not a story about a prodigal son. This is a story about who God is and his very nature. And then, as soon as that invitation is given to the son, come join the party, the story is over. We literally don't know what happens next. It goes to Luke 16. What happens next? Which, I'll be honest, is really frustrating. How many of you have ever been having a conversation with somebody and they're like, oh yeah, I saw this great movie, and you're like, be quiet. I don't want to know how it ends. You're going to Gladiator 2 came out. You want me to tell you how it ends? It's okay, I didn't go see it yet. But you'd be like, knock it off. I'd be a real jerk if I told you the ending, right? I'm going to guess somebody wins. There you go, a Gladiator movie. I don't know. Maybe everybody loses. Who knows? But the end is kind of the point, right? Like, we want to know what is the end of the story, and that is the point. Jesus walked away after telling this story, and the people were left to finish the story. And you and I, 2,000 years later, are meant to notice that. You and I finish the story. Everybody who hears this story writes the ending. We write it by how we choose to respond to the kindness of God towards sinners, ourselves and others. Now, I'm going to say this. We know how this story ended. We have Scripture. There's some men who found some wood. It was fixed to a broken, bleeding, humiliated Jesus. That's how this story ended. And instead of coming home, those men killed this God that they could not understand. It was a God who didn't fit their picture. A God who, even as he hung on the cross, offered forgiveness to all those prodigals who were killing him and still asked them to come home. Still asked them to come home. They wrote what they believed to be the end of the story, and in this incredible twist, the very ending they wrote got rewritten by the God that they tried to kill. He beat death. God beat death. And today he calls all of us home. So that leaves us here today. What is your posture towards God today? A lot of times it can be seen in our attitudes towards other people. And all I know is that there's a party. There is a party and everybody is invited, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want anybody else to miss it. I don't want to miss it because I'm blind to what God is doing in the lives of other people either. I want to be a part of that party. And sometimes I think the party is thrown in ways we never expect. And I just want to leave you with this story, okay? I think maybe I've shared this before here, but it fits, and it's one of the most favorite things I've ever heard in my entire life. This last week, a man by the name of Tony Campolo passed away. Tony Campolo, many of you probably don't know who that is, incredible man of God. And I had the privilege of hearing him speak at a chapel service at Olivet, Nazarene University, back in the 90s. And he was a sociologist, but he's also a pastor. He was on staff at Eastern College, and just had a heart for people who most people would write off as trash. So one time, and this story is just, I heard this story early on in my life, and it's had a huge impact. He was asked to speak at an engagement in Honolulu, Hawaii. Well, he's from Philly, and so there's a 6-hour difference. So that really screwed up his body. So at 3:30 in the morning, he found himself awake and hungry. And so in Honolulu, he went to this greasy diner. And he goes to this greasy diner, sits down, he starts drinking a cup of stale coffee and eating a donut. And 8 or 9 prostitutes come walking into the diner, and they're loud and boisterous. And they come in, they sit down, and here's Tony Campolo, the preacher, the only other person in the room, and Harry, who's the guy working the counter, and these 8 or 9 prostitutes. They sit down, they start talking really loud, and one of them, Agnes, says, "Hey, tomorrow's my birthday." And a couple of the other ladies, they're like, "Well, what do we care? What, do you want to throw you a party or something? We don't get parties. What are you telling us this for? What do you want from us?" And she's like, "I just was sharing the information. I've never had a birthday party before. I don't, forget it. I forget I even brought it up." So after a while, there's some hubbub, and then they leave. And then Tony Campolo is sitting there, and he talks to this Harry guy. He says, "Hey, do they come in here every night?" He says, "Yeah, they usually wander in here between 3:30, somewhere around there." And he says, "What about the one that was sitting right next to me?" And Harry says, "That's Agnes, yeah." And he said, "Well, I heard her say it's her birthday tomorrow." And Harry says, "Well, who cares?" He says, "Well, I care." He's like, "What do you think if we have a birthday party, a surprise birthday party tomorrow? Tomorrow morning, let's have a surprise birthday party for Agnes." And Harry kind of got a smile on his face and said, "Yeah, let's do that." So Harry's going to make a cake, and Tony's going to go out and buy decorations. So he shows up early the next night, about 3 o'clock. He puts decorations, these happy birthday Agnes, and all these decorations, all in this nasty, greasy diner, all this different stuff. And here's Harry's got this big old cake for her birthday and all this stuff. And sure enough, somehow the word got out that there was going to be a birthday party. And this diner is wall-to-wall prostitutes. And Tony Campolo. So it's wall-to-wall prostitutes, and here's Tony, and all of a sudden Agnes walks in, and when Agnes walks in, everybody launches, "Happy birthday, Agnes, happy birthday to you," and they start singing and celebrating and all this, and she's just dumbfounded. She can't control herself. She begins to weep. She stumbles, she sits down on a stool, and Harry brings out this cake with candles and says, "Agnes, blow the candles out. You need to blow the candles out right now." And she's like, I can't. And so Harry has to blow the candles out, and she's almost inconsolable. And he puts a knife in her hand and says, "Cut the cake, Agnes. I want you to cut the cake now." And so she tries to cut it, and she's like, "Hang on, can I do something? Do we have to cut it now?" Like, "Well, you don't have to cut it now. It's your cake. You can do whatever you want." She's like, I only live a couple doors down. I want to take it home and show my mom. I've never had a birthday cake. I want to show my mom my birthday cake. They're like, "I'll be right back." And so she does. She carries it like it's this baby. And she walks out the door of the diner, and she walks down the street. And there's Tony Campolo standing there in the silence with all of these prostitutes. And this is what he says. He says, "Hey, let's pray." So here he is. He decides to pray. So he prays for Agnes, and he prays for all these women who are in this restaurant. And after he says amen, he kind of sits back down on the stool, and they're all kind of milling around, drinking their coffee, waiting for Agnes to come back. And Harry, the guy working the diner, he leans over, he says, "Hey, Campolo, so you didn't tell me you were a preacher." And he says, Yeah, I mean, that's what I do." He's like, "Well, what kind of church do you go to? What kind of church do you preach at?" And in a moment of brilliance, Tony Campolo says this: "I preach at a church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning." So then Harry says, "No, you don't." If there was a church like that, I'd go to it. Listen, sometimes we're so blind. We're so blind. We fail to see what God is doing in front of us. I would just challenge you to always allow God to be the one that challenges your picture of who He is. I'm going to ask the worship team from Olivet to come. We're going to sing a song we sang earlier because I think it's truly fitting to where this is at today. But I just want to challenge you today. Continue to seek God's face in every situation. Continue to ask Him to reveal to you who He is. I can guarantee you there is a party going on every second of every day. If we open our eyes wide enough, we can actually see what God is doing in our midst. And I want to tell you, I'm more excited to be your pastor today than I have for 4 years. And here's why. Here's why. I feel like blinders have fallen off somewhere in the life of our church. And we're actually seeing people for who they are, created in the image of God. And we're seeing what God is doing in the lives of people and the transformation that God is bringing about in the lives of the people who are walking through the doors of this church for the very first time. And to me, that's a reason to party. That's a reason for a celebration. We need to celebrate the activity of God among us, particularly when it looks completely different than any way we could describe, and understand that God is inviting all people home. When they come home, it doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what you've said, doesn't matter what you've done. I can't explain that. It just doesn't. He loves you with this everlasting, unconditional love, and just giving Him the opportunity to wrap His arms around you leads to the transformation that God wants to see in our lives. I just want to encourage you to embrace that. Can I pray? And then we're going to sing, and then I'll close everything out. But I'm going to ask you to stand if you would. Father, your grace is sufficient. Your grace is good. Your grace is over and abundant, Father, in every one of our lives. So I pray that you would help us to see it. Father, help us to experience your warm embrace today as we come home. As we come home. Let's sing together.